In 1939, a ship called the SS St. Louis set sail from Hamburg, Germany, carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees. These desperate souls were fleeing the growing terror of Nazi persecution, hoping to find safety across the Atlantic. Their destination? The United States of America, beacon of hope in a darkening world. But as the St. Louis approached American waters, that hope began to fade. Despite the pleas of passengers and humanitarian groups, the United States government denied the ship entry. The reasons given were bureaucratic immigration quotas, concerns about financial burdens, but the consequences were all too human. With heavy hearts, the captain was forced to turn the ship round. Cuba and Canada also refused to take in the refugees, leaving them with no safe harbor. As the St. Louis sailed back towards Europe, the world watched in silence. Many of those on board would later perish in the Holocaust, victims, not just of Nazi brutality, but of global indifference. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1930s, as the situation for Jews in Europe grew increasingly dire, America's doors remained largely closed. U.S. immigration policy at the time was designed to keep people out, not welcome them in. Officials often invoked the public charge rule, arguing that refugees might become financial burdens on the state. But behind these cold calculations lay very real human suffering. Families torn apart, lives put on hold, and for many, a death sentence delayed but not avoided. The St. Louis became a powerful symbol of this failure, a missed opportunity to save lives that haunts us to this day. As Nazi oppression intensified, the trickle of refugees seeking sanctuary became a flood. Yet time and again, they found themselves turned away. Embassies were instructed to postpone visa applications. Even children were denied entry, their fate sealed by rubber stamps and red tape. What makes this chapter of history so painful is not just the tragedy itself, but how preventable it seems in hindsight. The United States had the capacity to help to offer refuge to those in desperate need, but a combination of factors, economic fears, isolationist sentiment, and yes, anti-Semitism led to a policy of inaction. This raises difficult questions that echo through the decades. How much did American officials know about the true extent of Nazi atrocities? And if they knew, why didn't they do more? The answers are complex, tied up in the politics and prejudices of the time, but they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, remaining neutral in the face of evil is itself a form of complicity. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s and America entered World War II, the full horror of the Holocaust began to come to light. Reports of mass killings and death camps filtered back to Washington. Yet even then, rescue efforts were slow to materialize. Bureaucratic obstacles remained in place, and political will was lacking. It wasn't until 1944 that President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, tasked with rescuing and providing relief to victims of enemy oppression. While the board did manage to save thousands of lives in its final months of operation, for many, it came too late. The story of America's response to the refugee crisis of the 1930s and 40s is not one of simple villains and heroes. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, prejudice, and political inertia. It shows how easily humanitarian principles can be set aside in times of uncertainty and the terrible cost of such decisions. In the years following World War II, as the full scale of the Holocaust became known, there was a period of national soul-searching. How could this have happened? And how could we have done so little to prevent it? These questions led to changes in refugee policy and a renewed commitment to human rights on the global stage. But the lessons of this dark chapter are not confined to history books. They resonate today, as we grapple with new refugee crises and humanitarian challenges. The faces may be different, the circumstances unique to our time, but the fundamental question remains the same. How will we respond when fellow human beings cry out for help? The story of the SS St. Louis and the broader failure to rescue Jewish refugees should serve as a stark reminder. It shows us how easily fear can override compassion, how bureaucracy can become a shield against moral responsibility. But it also challenges us to do better, to learn from past mistakes and choose a different path when faced with similar dilemmas. As we reflect on this history, we're left with a profound question. Should humanitarian protection override political hesitation during times of crisis? The answer may seem clear in hindsight, but putting it into practice requires courage, empathy, and a willingness to act even when it's difficult. This isn't about assigning blame to past generations. It's about understanding our shared history so we can shape a more just and compassionate future. It's a call to remain vigilant, against the forces of hatred and indifference that can take root in any society. The passengers of the SS St. Louis and countless other refugees denied entry during those dark years deserved better. Their story is a powerful reminder that our actions or inactions in times of moral crisis define us as individuals and as a nation. As we face new challenges in our own time, let us carry this lesson forward. Let us strive to be a people who open our hearts and our borders to those fleeing persecution and terror, for in doing so, we not only offer hope to the desperate, we reaffirm our own humanity and the values we hold dear. The choice is ours. Will we learn from history, or are we doomed to repeat its darkest chapters? The answer lies not just in our words, but in our actions, in how we respond when faced with the plea, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." For in the end, it is not just the fate of refugees that hangs in the balance, but the very soul of our nation. By 1942, the United States had received undeniable evidence of the mass killings taking place in Nazi-occupied Europe. Yet, despite this knowledge, official refugee policies remained stubbornly restrictive. The Evian Conference of 1938 had brought together 32 nations, led by the U.S., to discuss support for refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. But the conference proved to be little more than a hollow gesture, with few countries willing to open their doors to those in desperate need. As the situation in Europe deteriorated, private aid groups scrambled to help, but official government efforts were painfully limited. It wasn't until 1944, under mounting pressure from various quarters, that the U.S. finally established the War Refugee Board. This organization would go on to save tens of thousands of lives, but for millions, it came far too late. The delay in action wasn't due to a lack of information, it was a calculated political decision that would have far-reaching consequences. The Evian Conference of 1938 stands as a stark reminder of the world's initial reluctance to act. Convened by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the conference was ostensibly aimed at finding solutions for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany and Austria. However, the results were disheartening. Most countries, including the United States, refused to relax their immigration quotas or make significant commitments to accept refugees. The message sent to the Nazi regime was clear. The world was unwilling to intervene on behalf of the persecuted Jews. Fast forward to 1942, and the situation had become even more dire. U.S. intelligence agencies had confirmed reports of mass extermination in Nazi-occupied territories. The scale of the atrocities was staggering, yet official policy remained largely unchanged. The State Department, under the leadership of officials like Breckinridge Long, continued to place obstacles in the way of those seeking refuge. Visa restrictions were tightened, and bureaucratic red tape was used to slow the process of admitting refugees. It wasn't until January 1944 that President Roosevelt, facing increasing pressure from Jewish organizations, members of his own administration, and public opinion, established the War Refugee Board. This agency was tasked with rescuing and providing relief to victims of enemy oppression who were in imminent danger of death. While the board's efforts were commendable, saving an estimated 200,000 lives, it was a case of too little, too late for the millions who had already perished. The reasons for the delayed response were complex. Anti-Semitism played a role, as did concerns about domestic politics and the potential economic burden of accepting large numbers of refugees. There was also a pervasive fear that Nazi spies might infiltrate the country disguised as refugees. These factors combined to create a climate of inaction, even as the evidence of genocide mounted. The limited number of visas issued, the bureaucratic delays, and the internal opposition within the U.S. government all contributed to stalling rescue efforts. Stories abound of desperate refugees, with valid visas in hand, being turned away at American consulates due to last-minute policy changes or arbitrary decisions by officials. The human cost of these policies was immeasurable, with countless lives lost that might have been saved had action been taken sooner. Historians continue to debate the extent to which more could have been done in the crucial years before the establishment of the War Refugee Board. Some argue that earlier intervention could have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. Others point to the constraints of the time, the Great Depression, isolationist sentiment, and the challenges of wartime mobilization as factors that limited the U.S. response. What is clear, however, is that the information about the Nazi atrocities was available well before 1944. The decision not to act more decisively was a conscious choice, one that has left an indelible mark on history. The question remains, how might events have unfolded differently if the United States and other nations had chosen to act sooner and more forcefully. As the war drew to a close and the full horror of the Holocaust became apparent, the world was forced to confront the consequences of its inaction. The establishment of the United Nations and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were, in part, responses to the failures of the international community during this dark period. But would these developments lead to a fundamental shift in U.S. policy towards refugees and humanitarian crises? The post-war era would bring new challenges and new opportunities for the United States to redefine its role on the global stage. How would the lessons of the Holocaust shape American foreign policy and attitudes towards international humanitarian obligations? The story of America's response to the refugee crisis of World War II serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of inaction in the face of human suffering. It raises uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility, national interests, and the obligations of powerful nations in times of global crisis. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we are confronted with a sobering question. What is worse, not knowing about atrocities taking place, or knowing and still choosing to do nothing? The answer to this question has implications that extend far beyond the events of World War II, challenging us to consider how we respond to humanitarian crises in our own time. The legacy of this period continues to shape discussions about refugee policy, humanitarian intervention, and the role of the United States in addressing global crises. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolationism and the importance of swift action in the face of human rights abuses. As we grapple with contemporary refugee crises and humanitarian challenges, the lessons of the past loom large. The choices made by nations and individuals during times of moral crisis have the power to shape the course of history. The question now is, how will we apply these lessons to the challenges of our own era? What's worse, not knowing or knowing and still doing nothing? As the dust settled on World War II, America found itself facing a new challenge. The conflict that had reshaped the world was over, but its aftermath lingered in the form of thousands of displaced Holocaust survivors. These were people who had endured unimaginable horrors, clinging to the hope of a new life in the land of the free. But for many, that dream would remain frustratingly out of reach. The United States, a nation built on the backs of immigrants, now seemed hesitant to open its doors. Strict quotas, remnants of pre-war policies, remained firmly in place. Fear and suspicion, fueled by years of isolationism and wartime propaganda, cast a long shadow over the plight of these refugees. As a result, countless survivors found themselves trapped in limbo, languishing in displaced persons camps across Europe. Picture, if you will, the faces of these survivors, men, women, and children, their eyes haunted by memories of unspeakable loss, now forced to wait in cramped, makeshift shelters, their possessions reduced to whatever they could carry, their futures hanging in the balance. All the while, bureaucratic red tape and political inertia kept them from the sanctuary they so desperately sought. It wasn't until 1948, 3 long years after the war's end, that America finally took significant action. The Displaced Persons Act, signed into law by President Truman, at last provided a pathway for more refugees to enter the country. But for many, this relief came too late. Years of waiting had taken their toll, both physically and emotionally. The delay in action wasn't due to a lack of awareness. Reports of the Holocaust and its aftermath had reached American shores. Newspapers carried stories of the camps, of families torn apart, of a people nearly wiped from existence. Yet public opinion remained divided. Some Americans, moved by compassion, called for immediate action. Others, still wary of outsiders, urged caution and restraint. This tension between fear and empathy, between isolationism and engagement, would come to define America's post-war refugee policy. It's a struggle that continues to echo in our modern debates about immigration and asylum. The faces may have changed, the conflicts may be different, but the fundamental questions remain the same. As we look back on this chapter of our history, it's crucial to understand that this story isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns, about learning from the past to shape a more compassionate future. Because history has a way of repeating itself if we let it. Consider the parallels to today's refugee crises. Once again, we see desperate people fleeing violence and persecution. Once again, we hear voices of both welcome and warning. And once again, we as a nation must grapple with the fundamental question: what responsibility does a country have to those fleeing certain death, even if they're strangers? The story of America's response to Jewish refugees after World War II serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of inaction. It challenges us to examine our values, to question our fears, and to consider the human cost of closed borders. As we face new humanitarian crises around the globe, will we recognize these patterns when they appear again? In the camps of post-war Europe, survivors clung to hope. They dreamed of a new life in America, of safety, of the chance to rebuild what had been so cruelly taken from them. For some, that dream would eventually become reality. For others, it would remain forever out of reach. Imagine the weight of that waiting, the uncertainty, the fear that, having survived the unthinkable, they might now be forgotten by the world. Each day in the camps was a test of resilience, a battle against despair, and all the while, across the ocean, a nation debated their fate. The reasons for America's slow response were complex. Economic concerns played a role, as did lingering anti-Semitism and fears of communist infiltration. Some argued that the country, still recovering from the war, couldn't handle an influx of refugees. Others worried about the impact on jobs and social services. But there were also voices of compassion. Religious leaders, humanitarian organizations, and some politicians pushed for more generous policies. They argued that America had a moral obligation to help, that turning away those in need went against the very principles the country claimed to stand for. The debate raged in newspapers, in town halls, and in the halls of Congress. It was a struggle for the soul of the nation, a test of America's commitment to its ideals in the face of fear and uncertainty. When the Displaced Persons Act finally passed in 1948, it marked a turning point. The legislation wasn't perfect, it still contained restrictions and biases, but it opened the door wider than before. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, including many Holocaust survivors, would find new homes in America. For those who made it, the journey was just beginning. They faced the challenges of adapting to a new culture, learning a new language, and building lives from scratch. Many carried the scars of their experiences, both physical and emotional, but they also brought with them resilience, determination, and a deep appreciation for the freedoms they now enjoyed. Their stories became part of the American tapestry, a reminder of both the darkest chapters of human history and the enduring power of hope. They and their descendants would go on to make significant contributions to their adopted country, enriching its culture, economy, and intellectual life. But we must not forget those who never made it, those for whom help came too late. Their fates stand as a somber reminder of the cost of indecision and fear. They challenge us to do better, to act more swiftly and compassionately when faced with humanitarian crises. As we reflect on this history, we're confronted with uncomfortable truths about our past, but we're also presented with an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to recommit ourselves to the ideals of compassion and human dignity. Today, as new refugee crises unfold around the world, we find ourselves at another crossroads. The debates of the past echo in our current discussions about immigration and asylum. Once again, we're called to balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations, to weigh economic impacts against moral imperatives. The story of America's response to Jewish refugees after World War II isn't just a history lesson. It's a mirror held up to our present. It asks us to consider, how will we respond to today's displaced and persecuted? Will we learn from the past, or are we doomed to repeat its mistakes? These are not easy questions. They challenge us to confront our fears, to examine our values, and to think deeply about what kind of nation we want to be. But they are questions we must grapple with, for how we answer them will shape not only the lives of countless individuals, but also the character of our country. As we face these challenges, let us remember the faces of those who waited in the camps, who dreamed of safety and freedom. Let us consider the cost of inaction and the power of compassion. And let us ask ourselves, when future generations look back on our time, what will they say about how we responded to those in desperate need? The choice is ours. Will we turn away, or will we open our hearts and our borders? Will we let fear guide our policies, or will we find the courage to live up to our highest ideals? The answers to these questions will define us as a nation and as a people. History has its eyes on us. The echoes of the past remind us of what's at stake. As we write the next chapter of our story, let us strive to make it one of compassion, courage, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. For in the end, how we treat the stranger, the refugee, the displaced, is a measure not just of our policies, but of our humanity.